minutes. So we won't have time for questions or, and I hate this, stories from the audience at the end of it. I want to make sure that we have enough time to see everything, and if anybody needs to slip out a little early, no hard feelings. I do want to remind you, tomorrow at 6 p.m. is our next Under the Light program here in the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Millsaps College history professor Stephanie Rolfe will discuss the organized resistance of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and Jackson State University's Mad Drama Troupe will perform. That's free at 6 p.m. in the Civil Rights Museum. And then I hope that you'll be able to join us back here next week for History's Lunch when Roger Stoley will discuss his new book, and this could be, a little low-key, Mississippi Juke Joint Confidential, House Parties, Hustlers, and the Blues Life. Or maybe it won't be. Today, though, we are delighted to have our friend, the award-winning filmmaker Rex Jones, for another History is Lunch, this time to screen his new documentary, Camille, the Original Monster Storm. Rex Jones is an instructor with the Southern Documentary Project at the University of Mississippi. A native of Hickory, Mississippi, Jones holds an MFA in Science and Natural History Filmmaking from Montana State University. Help me welcome Rex Jones.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. I'll keep my comments brief because, like Chris said, we are going to be running pretty close here. It's about a 56-minute film, so if you have to get up and leave, that's fine. If you can hang out afterwards for Q&A or comments or anything like that, I'll be around, and so we can just do that informally if anybody would like to do it. Camille was the original monster storm back before Katrina, and this past Saturday, August the 17th, was the 50th anniversary of Camille. We as a people, we enjoy commemorating these big anniversaries, these golden anniversaries, and of course, this was it for Camille. And so that made it all the more important for me, it having been 50 years in the past, for me to commemorate this thing because it's so important to get these stories before they're lost forever. So I spent about the last year researching this film, gathering up archive materials, finding persons to interview, and putting the movie together. And so we premiered it this Saturday down on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. This will be the Jackson premiere of the film. And if you just enjoy it so much and you want to see it again, it'll be on Mississippi Public Broadcasting a week from today at 8 p.m. That's Wednesday the 28th, and then it will have an encore presentation on September the 1st, and that's at 4 p.m., I think. So I really want to thank you all for coming. This is such a magnificent crowd and such a wonderful facility here, and I'm really excited to see it for the first time. And I hope you all enjoy the movie, and if you can hang around afterwards, be glad to talk to you or listen to your Camille stories. Thank you.
Because there had never been a storm of such magnitude.
When you go out today and you look out over the Mississippi Sound, which is an extension of the Gulf of Mexico, you see maybe one of the most beautiful places in the world that God has created. Well, that water can get mean as the dickens, so you have to have great respect if you live on the water to know that serenity and that beauty can turn into a monster storm, and you better be ready for it. It's a price you pay for living in paradise.
Summing up Hurricane Camille is very difficult because there had never been a storm of such magnitude striking a populated area. I thought Betsy was bad. I was in Betsy in New Orleans, but that was the third grade fist fight on the playground compared to this monster. Camille was a very, very powerful storm, an unusual storm. And one of the things that made it so difficult in our forecasting is at the time when it was strengthening quite rapidly, we didn't know how strong the storm was. The instruments we had to work with at the time of Camille were not nearly as elaborate as they are today. We had just begun to use radar for the first time, and so we did have a network of coastal radar. So once the hurricane moved within maybe 150 to 100 miles of the coastline, we could pick it up on radar. But satellite pictures were just beginning to be developed. We saw the first satellite pictures of the entire Atlantic in 1966. So here we have 1969. We saw the satellite pictures of Camille, and boy, it looked bad, But we didn't know how bad because we'd never seen a storm of that intensity prior to Camille. We know that there are certain conditions that favor strengthening. For example, warm water. Hurricanes like warm water, all right? Hurricanes don't like to have their tops blown off. We call that vertical shear. So if you have strong winds up around 40, 50,000 feet, it'll blow the tops of them off. Hurricanes don't like that. Well, in the case of Camille, there were very quiet winds in the upper part of the atmosphere. At the same time, there were very warm water in the Gulf of Mexico. And so those conditions favored strengthening, and it deepened very, very rapidly.
Hurricane Camille came in on a Sunday, late Sunday evening. That day was a beautiful day, and the storm had been playing around down south of the Mississippi River. And about noon of that day, it was determined that it looked like she was going to come on in to the coast and was going to be extremely powerful, predicted to be the most powerful hurricane in the history of the United States.
Yes, get me Gulfport, civil defense.
Yeah?
Wade, Bill Tilson, Mobile Weather Bureau.
Yes, Mr. Bill.
Hate to wake you, but Camille's changing course, turning north now, instead of east. Looks like she's going to hit you right where you live.
For 24 hours, the whole Gulf Coast had been on hurricane watch, people sleeping at their posts. And now...
Harrison County Civil Defense to Biloxi CD. Come back, please.
Yes?
Julie?
Mobile Weather says it's coming. Wake everybody up.
A bunch of my fraternity brothers and I said, well, hell, let's go on down there. A hurricane's coming. Man, we're going to go down there and help out. And so I drove down with 4 or 5 of the guys, and we reported to headquarters there in Gulfport. And my dad said, get your ass back to Hattiesburg. What do you think you're doing down here? There's nothing you can do down here but get in the way. So you just go on back up to school so I don't have to worry about you. Which, of course, is exactly what we didn't do. Instead, we went to my house over on Seal Avenue, right off the beach. And we decided we were going to have a hurricane party.
So an Air Force plane went out and flew into it and found that the pressure was 908 millibars. That was the strongest hurricane that had ever been recorded by an airplane at that time. In other words, the central pressure is a measure of how strong the hurricane is. The people that were developing storm surge models, and again, we're going back to a time when storm surge models were just being developed. When they found out that the pressure was down around 905 millibars, they came in and said, you know what that means? That means you're going to have a storm surge in excess of 20 feet. Well, we had never put 20 feet in an advisory. And after pondering this issue for some time, we finally indicated that it looks like the storm surge of this would be 15 to 20 feet. And it was that warning that really encouraged a number of people to evacuate the coast.
Most people take the advice to get out, and cars start streaming north. A 100,000 people have listened and left. Left behind, the young who think nothing can ever hurt them. The unbelievers who plan to ride it out, the sightseers, the thrill seekers, the stubborn.
One reason we lost many people in Camille is they said, oh, well, we rode out the 47 hurricane here, we rode out Betsy here, and we'll ride this one out too. And we had contour maps telling them, You're going to get 35 feet of water here tonight. You're a 20-foot contour line. You ain't 15 feet tall. Well, still, they didn't believe us. And so we pulled them out of the swamps the next morning dead because they didn't believe it.
They literally went door to door warning people that this is a big one coming through. You need to get out of the house. You need to go.
No, we're not getting out.
Well then, would you give me the names of your next of kin?
Say, you're serious about this, aren't you?
Mister, I've never been more serious in my life.
Pipe up. Let's pack up.
But we'll get up on the third floor. The water won't get that high.
But if the first and second floor go, the third floor is coming down.
I was deeply concerned. The lives of my littlest child, my wife, my mother, and my young cousin who had come for a vacation on the coast depended on decisions. And when you're responsible, you have to make the best decisions that you can make. And it was too late by the time they said the storm was coming here to go anywhere, to get out. And I'll tell you that it was a night to remember.
It's now 6:30 p.m. Sunday in Biloxi, Mississippi, and the hurricane is really beginning to be felt here. As you can see, the palm trees are blowing, the rain is beginning to increase, and the sea is beginning to churn in the Gulf. It promises to be a long, long night in Biloxi.
About 9 o'clock, lightning must have hit and knocked the power out. And I know about that time, Mom very much encouraged Dad to leave our home.
Mom got very nervous and she was starting to pack little things here and there, but Daddy held fast and said we weren't going anywhere, that it was just fine. It was around 10 o'clock at night, and Camille had already hit us at that point. And Mama turned to Daddy. I remember this like it was yesterday. She turned to Daddy and she said, "I don't know about you, but me and the kids are leaving." And we got in the car. We drove, I think it's about a mile, maybe less, to the Hansboro Baptist Church. And Mama knocked on the door, banging on the door for them to let us in. And I remember Mama sitting down, and there were three of us, my brother and my sister and me. And Mama sitting there having us, she was like a hen with her chicks. And she put her arms around us as we sat around her. And I remember her sitting there crying and praying that we would be safe. Some of our neighbors, I remember talking with them about it and them saying, we could not believe that we looked out the window and we saw your car leaving in the midst of the storm.
You know, the winds of Camille were really unprecedented. They say 200 miles an hour, but it's the water that did the killing. People miss that. Water is very heavy. A cubic yard of water weighs 1,733 pounds. Now think about that coming at race car speed in waves. Bam, bam, bam. That'll batter anything down.
Historically, it's shown that we lose most people because of water-related deaths, be it if it's storm surge, be it if it's inland flooding, be it if it's rainfall, flash flooding.
You could probably live through the winds of any hurricane unless you get hit by something being hurled by it, like a missile. But if you keep your head down and stay out of it, you're probably going to live through it, but the water will get you. That's what does the killing.
Now, you remember now, in a hurricane, you have three effects that we worry about. Number one, everybody knows that a hurricane is a big wind. And we can do something about that by having better building codes. You also know that hurricanes probably have a lot of rain. Well, that's a function of how fast they're moving. If they move very fast, you're not going to get a lot of rain. A slow-moving storm, it can dump 20, 30 inches of rain. But the deadliest part of the hurricane is the storm surge. 9 out of 10 people who die in a hurricane drown in the storm surge. 24 feet was the highest storm surge that we had ever recorded in the United States at the time of Camille. So it was the storm surge that not only did damage to the buildings, but also caused the loss of life.
This hurricane was so different from others because the wind kept getting stronger and stronger, and we knew it was far stronger than any we'd ever experienced before. We could think of the winds in Hurricane Betsy back in '47, and we were here during that and had no real problem. So when this one got so much worse than that, we knew we were in for a bad time.
Well, how many people are we talking about, Mrs. Fortner?
About 22.
About 22. That's amazing that you didn't lose one single life in all of this.
No one was hurt.
Well, did you?
And actually, one fellow slept through the whole hurricane in his room, and we wakened him this morning and told him about it.
You mean he slept in this building?
Right. He slept in this building all night long. And,
well, let me ask you this, Mr. Fortner. At any time, was there any doubt in your mind whether or not all 22 were going to perish?
I should say there was. We stayed down in the lobby of the hotel until the actual storm surge hit the hotel. And our first indication that the water was even up over the beach road was water seeping under the door of the lobby. And then a short time later, the lobby doors simply will burst open, and a wave roared right down through the lobby and down the hall of the hotel.
Calls started coming in from the people that had telephones asking to be evacuated, and they went out in their ducks, the amphibious vehicles, and got as many people as they could, but could only do that to a certain point before there was no way to get through the waters, to get to the people. They were trapped, they were there.
Already one of Gulfport's heavy-duty rescue teams is in trouble.
What's your 1020?
Rescue Red has gone out on one mission too many. Their truck is swamped in the rising tide.
To hell with the radio and the equipment. Abandon your machine.
There's so much going on, you really don't get the chance to get scared. And a couple of days later, you figure, I don't know how I did all that. When Camille was threatening the coast, we was already at a drill. So we started moving vehicles, and there was a group of us that stayed on the point there where the Seafood Museum is now. When the water started coming in, it came in 2 waves. And we was thinking the tide would be like it was in the '47 hurricane, which only came up to the flagpole. So when it went past the flagpole and got inside the building, we went out. We had a lock standing by, and we all got on that lock. And instead of going through the gate, the lock driver just went through the fence. We made that turn on the Howard Avenue. Well, we picked up something in the rear wheel. Then we was disabled. We was just floating. And I opened up the hatch and got the anchor line out. And we was kind of close to a house. So I had a couple of guys hold on the rope while I dove overboard and swam to the house and tied the lock up to the house. And we just sat on the side of the house. And when a big wind would come, the house would leave the pillars, and we would go up with the house and then come down. So another lock heard us, and he was able to make his way down and pick us up. When I wrote up the after-action report and put down about diving overboard and swimming to the house and tying it off, they ended up awarding me the Soldier's Medal, which is the highest award you can be given in peacetime.
Camille was a very tight storm, and it was a very fast storm. It ran for a couple of hours, and then
the next morning, we all went back on up to Hattiesburg. I came back a few days later and was going to take my usual route down to the beach, hang a left, and I got to the beach and there wasn't a Highway 90 left.
I was out of town and left my car in New Orleans with my brother and his wife. After Camille, on my way back, I had to go through Poplarville, Mississippi, which I was real reluctant about coming through Poplarville because of it's a little different than the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast was always a little bit more liberal than Poplarville was, and I was a little reluctant about coming through Poplarville, but it turned out coming through Poplarville, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. And I also think that because of Camille, that had a lot to do with people getting together, meeting each other, and helping each other out regardless of what the situation was racial-wise.
When the storm was gone and we walked out and we saw what was the result, I began early on to learn words like devastation.
She actually wiped out Pass Christian, Mississippi. Pass Christian is a peninsula off of the Bay of St. Louis and the Gulf, and the water went all the way across and absolutely wiped out the town.
The winds were terrific. They say that there were a lot of tornadoes. At the fire station here, we didn't exactly experience a tornado. We could hear the wind that sounded like the freight train, but it was blowing in a straight puff of wind. And gravel from a building across the street sounded like machine gun bullets pelting the building. It broke out all the windows in the cars around the fire station.
We flew down to Pass Christian first, and we were shocked to find that that $7 million bridge that goes across the Bay of St. Louis was literally out of service. Those 200-ton slabs had been displaced as much as 6 feet in some areas. That was quite a shocker because the centerline elevation of that bridge is 20 feet. The railroad bridge was totally washed out. The front beach of Pass Christian was just absolutely devastated. There were huge craters in downtown Pass Christian where once roads had been. And then as we flew on, I saw that some of the old landmarks had just been totally destroyed. The old mansion in Pass Christian, the little Episcopal church.
Seabees had just been reactivated in 1966 because of Vietnam, and they got training in a war zone when that thing struck.
Hurricane Camille sealed the deal with the community and the Seabees. The Seabees has a secondary mission area of disaster recovery. Our primary mission area is construction and defending what we build, but a secondary mission area is called disaster recovery. And disaster recovery could be from nuclear, biological, or chemical warfare, or natural disasters. We are uniquely qualified because we have the equipment and we have the training to do it. Monday morning, we were trying to negotiate our way down to the base. Of course, the streets were full of limbs and trees and garbage and everything. And going down Highway 49, sometimes there would be all 4 lanes open, and sometimes it'd have to get into 2 lanes. And we got down to the base, and when I went on that base, I could not believe the devastation that I was looking at. It was just like an atomic bomb had hit. We was assigned to the city of Pass Christian, and Pass Christian was probably the worst area. It caught right at the eye of the storm. So we went out the gate going down toward the beach, and that's really when we saw the devastation. The Broad Avenue was lined with trees. We had to use our heavy equipment to get the trees out of the road so we could get down to the beach. And then once we got to the beach, there was part of the highways that was washed up. We got on down to Pass Christian and set up headquarters there. And it wasn't long after that they formed us up, and we did arm-to-arm sweeps. We would start at the railroad tracks, and we would go down as far as we could, and then we would march south toward the beach, going into all the different homes and whatever to see if we could find
anybody that needed help, or we were also looking for bodies. There was a lot of people that died. You have to look at their mindset. They had survived Betsy in 1947, which was supposed to be the worst one, and we've never evacuated for a hurricane because, you know, it's just not that bad and whatever. Camille was a killer. The first body that I found was a woman with 2 children, and she was under. The house had collapsed on them, and she had 2 kids in her arms, and all 3 of them were dead. You have to really control your emotions, and Vietnam had kind of made us callous to seeing death, but it was devastating to some people. The younger guys that hadn't been to Vietnam and doing those body sweeps and things, it was traumatic to them. And I remember one time one of the chiefs told us, he said, "My gosh, boys," he said, "look down there." He said, "There's a mail bag," and he said, "We need to get that mail bag and get it to the post office." And one of the guys went down there. He sent one of the guys down there. One of the guys went down there and picked the mail bag up, and when he did, there was a body underneath it. And the body just kind of bobbed up like that, and it really scared all of us. And just, you know, of course, a lot of us had already seen dead bodies, but it's always shocking when you find one.
How many bodies have you found so far?
This makes 19 for us. The coroner's report last night about 8 o'clock was 88 confirmed in Harrison County.
Here lie the Richelieu apartments in Pass Christian, where some of the tenants refuse to get out.
But we'll get up on the 3rd floor. The water won't get that high.
Come in. Welcome to the hurricane party.
24 people decided to ride it out at the Richelieu. 23 died when the building collapsed. One youngster floated out a 3rd floor window on a mattress and lived.
The man on the 2nd floor, he had a drink, and he told me to come on up and join the party, that they were going to stay on the 3rd floor. And I told him, no, this was too serious. I told him to get out. He said, the man said, well, this is my property, and if you're going to arrest me, go ahead and arrest me. So I called the civil defense man, and the last thing he told me was to go back and get his address of the next of kin so we can notify him. And the man, he looked at me and he laughed.
I saw the remains of what I thought at the time and proved to be later the Richelieu apartments, where I had personally talked to some people that afternoon, and a lot of other folks had too, trying to get them out of there.
Powell, come in. Welcome to the hurricane party.
The greatest myth that came out of Camille was the idea that 23 people perished in a hurricane party in Pass Christian in the Richelieu apartments, and it did not happen.
One lady took it upon herself to claim that she was part of the party and that everybody died.
Just a high screeching sound. You know, the wind was so strong you couldn't hardly breathe out. It just seemed like it'd take your breath away, and you couldn't hear anything. Some people came floating close to me, and it was so pitch black you couldn't even see anything at all. And I'd hear them yelling and see their flashlights, and then as they would drown, you'd see the flashlight going under the water, and I'd know that, you know, that they were dead.
Well, there was no hurricane party and 23 people didn't die. I found out through Cat Bergeron's articles in the Daily Herald that there was another survivor named Ben Duckworth. I got in touch with him and he told me what happened. He said 8 people died and 6 lived through that. And I was one of the ones who lived, and Mary Ann was one of the ones who lived. And he said, I tried to correct it for years to tell people that that never happened. And he said they wouldn't listen to me. And they liked the myth so much that they just kept on doing it.
And then coming on in towards Gulfport, the damage was just obviously horrendous and far more than local government could handle.
As they continued their aerial tour, they saw the unthinkable.
As we flew down the beach on the aerial survey, there were automobiles literally thrown into the tops of trees. There were nothing but steps left where houses had once stood. The highway was destroyed in several places. The seawall held fairly well. The sand beach did its job. It attenuated the wave action a great deal, but it didn't give us much protection. As we moved on into Gulfport, we saw that Highway 90 was blocked by a seagoing barge. There was a seagoing tug vessel washed inshore several blocks. They drug it back to the highway later and made a little story out of it.
I was living in Chicago as a newlywed, and when the storm hit, I went into a complete panic because, as you know, Greek families are very close, and I was living so far away. And my dad and my mother, Gus and Irene Stevens, were still in the restaurant business at the time. So I had no way to contact them. There were no cell phones in those days. I couldn't get them by phone. Everything was down. So we turned on the television, and we were watching CBS News, and I saw my father come across the front of the restaurant on the beach, picking up his beloved restaurant sign. So that's the way I knew that my family was alive. What he said afterwards was the reason that the restaurant was salvaged, it was constructed from the bricks of an old Jewish synagogue. So he insisted that God had watched over Gus Stevens.
I got the car out as soon as I can to go check on my business, which was just north of what's now Jones Park at the foot of 25th Avenue on the south side of Highway 90. And I took Jack with me, and it took a while because all the streets had not been cleared of trees across them. It was a circuitous route to get downtown. Finally got there, and you had to go to the mayor's office to get a pass to prove who you were and why you were there because of the danger of wires and trees across the road, and because of looters. They didn't want anybody down there that didn't belong. So I remember driving down 25th Avenue, and we came to the intersection, and Jack, my 3-year-old, was standing in the seat beside me, and I'll never forget that child's words. He looked up and he looked at me and he said, "Daddy, park and eat all gone." And he was right. My business was totally destroyed.
500 small businesses were virtually wiped out. Nearly 100 vessels were grounded as sump shop. Most of the seafood industry was destroyed. The timber industry was crippled. Small craft harbors were in ruins. In Harrison County alone, over 60 resort properties suffered damage, half of them destroyed. Out of 55 food service establishments, all but 5 were gone, and most gas stations were destroyed. The estimate of Camille's damage to Mississippi alone is in excess of $1 billion.
I had never been through a hurricane. I thought all hurricanes were like Hurricane Camille. Turns out I just started off with a good one. I was a technical instructor in electronics at Keesler Air Force Base, civilian. And when the storm came, we were furloughed for several weeks. During that time, I took a few pictures, took them down to a real estate agent, and they recommended I take the pictures I took at downtown Gulfport out to something called the General Adjustment Bureau. They were the people that were charged with overseeing the insurance issues involved with the storm. There I was told to give the pictures to a man named Henry Griset, and he asked me if I would be available to take some pictures for the General Adjustment Bureau. So I told him, yeah, I could probably do that. So he told me he wanted me to go down to the Broadwater Beach Hotel, and he said, I want you to walk towards the Ocean Springs Bridge. And he said, I would like a picture of every individual piece of property or where you think an individual piece of property would have been. Since they didn't have anybody with ground level expertise or immediate knowledge of the area, and it wasn't the same as after Katrina where we were deluged with media. So I started off with my little Ricoh Singlex, branded under Sears Roebuck, and a 35mm wide-angle lens, and it took me about, conservatively 6 hours to just stroll from that point to the Ocean Springs Bridge. Of course, I was quite a bit younger. I was 31 when I did that. I took the pictures, I drove home, developed the film. Mr. Grisey came back to the house. He looked at my 18 rolls of film that were hanging dry, and at that time he said, we're going to pay you 75 cents a frame to cover your expenses. And he told me what he wanted me to do was to go back to the Broadwater and start walking the other way. And I said, how far am I going to go? And he said, I want you to go to Claremont Harbor. And it was well beyond Bay St. Louis Bridge and down the coast. And he said, take your time. You got a couple of weeks, and you don't need to have the pace you had on the 19th. I think it was 2,400 plus. It's a record. People know what happened. It was just a task to be done. I tried to do it the best I could.
It's been 7 long days since thousands of rescue workers have seen a bed, or their homes, or their wives.
Julie, you still there?
How are you, honey?
Tired.
Mom and Dad, when Wade and Julia went to work, they went to work, and they stayed at their emergency operating centers for, it must have been 10 or 12 days without a break.
Let's go.
Dad reached in the back of his truck, and he had a case of Jack's beer. And he said, man, I can't wait to have a beer. I don't care if it's hot or not. And he came and he sat on the front porch, and he got the church key out, you know, opened that beer, and it just went, didn't make any noise. It was water. It was water at the Jack's Brewery. It started putting in the cans to help the people from Hurricane Camille to give them some fresh water. So we had a case of water.
In one terrifying night, normal community life and growth had stopped. Only the basics mattered now. Food, water, shelter, medical care had to be provided for thousands of survivors. Wreckage, miles of it had to be cleared. There was a danger of epidemics from storm filth, and mass inoculations were given. As recovery efforts began, statistics filtered in. Nearly 74,000 families suffered loss, death, or injury, destruction or damage to homes, loss of jobs or income. Thousands of homes were completely destroyed. In vacant lots, a set of steps lead to nowhere.
A storm like that brings you really back to the law of the tooth and the claw. There's no power. There's a sparse enforcement, law enforcement. It brings us back to an era that we've never really experienced before. And you know, the veneer of civilization is very, very thin.
People take civilization for granted. They always think there's going to be lights, there's going to be gasoline for their cars, there's going to be water and food. They think all these things will always be there, and they don't really appreciate it until they don't have it anymore.
From an individual standpoint, we learn the kinds of things you need to grab onto prior to a storm. You need to get as much storage of fresh water as you can get, and you need to have batteries, and you need to have candles, and you need to be ready for the electricity to go out, and you need to have some canned goods so that you can do the things you need to do, and you need to be prepared for a lot of inconvenience.
One of the big things you see after a hurricane is everybody's cooking food, and it's a lot of seafood. And the reason they're cooking food is because they don't have any electricity. It's going to go away. It's going to be ruined.
We had gas stove at that time, so we could cook food. And some of the neighbors came because they had electric, and we could cook, and everybody shared rations, emptied their freezer, which would be good maybe for 2 days.
He was actually the first facility to open to be able to feed emergency crews. He actually contacted City Hall and told them that he was available to do the feeding because we had a tremendous amount of support down here, as we always do after a hurricane. So what he did was he got his people back. He had very loyal workers. We had over 100 employees. They all came back to work. He was able to get the waitresses back. The inventory was still there. And he was able to feed the emergency crews and the Red Cross and even help some of the people at City Hall.
And phones, they didn't have cell phones then. The phones were put in by Southern Bell, and you had to wait in long lines to use them. They just had whole banks of phones on plywood boards out in the open. And vermin everywhere, mosquitoes, snakes, and the fire ants were everywhere. And the Air Force decided to spray the whole coastline with Myrex to kill the fire ants, but the planes had to fly really low and really fast. And they had to fly early in the morning while the dew was still out. And like one woman said, gee, we lived through Camille, now the Air Force is trying to scare us to death because these big planes had come right over the ground, right just above the piles of debris spraying this stuff.
It's bound to be in here somewhere because all these are the houses that came from in this vicinity. They're all right in here in this neighborhood. But mine was right on the corner and I don't even see it. Yonder! That grave in yonder, that's mine!
A catastrophe like Camille is comparable to a war. That is, it's so devastating, and psychologically, some people have a harder time than others.
My house was under 12 feet of water. And I've seen about all my family has had destruction of their homes. I hope I never see nothing like this again. I'm mighty young, but it takes this hard blow.
If you lose everything in your house, everything.
Can you understand why anybody would stay here? Does that make sense to you?
No, not certainly not now.
When I look at all this, I kind of wish I'd stuck around and gone with the house.
My grandparents lived on Point Cadet, right on Highway 90, right next to St. Michael's Church. South of them was the Surf Bowl bowling alley. And I remember the days after Hurricane Camille when we went down to their house, and their entire front yard, besides being littered with all types of debris and wood and pieces of homes and shrimp boats, what they had was just a whole field of bowling balls and bowling pins. For months after that, we played backyard bowling in my mom and dad's yards who lived on Back Bay. It was an exciting time, kind of like an adventure, because as a young child, it's like camping out whenever you have no electricity, which means you have no air conditioning, and it's an adventure. But then you realize when you see the catastrophic storm come into your community, you're realizing that it's destroying people's lives. You're realizing that it's destroying all of their lifetime possessions, pictures of their families from years ago, any kind of mementos they might have had from when they were children or their grandchildren. You come to realize the tremendous catastrophic impact that it has on a community and on the members of that community.
My experience with Camille actually started 2 years before Camille, when we had our first experience with Mother Nature in the way of a tornado. The house that my father had built was in rubble. 6 months, 9 months thereafter, he bought a trailer to house his family in while he personally would build the house back. His fate would have it, Camille hit, and that Viceroy trailer was turned over. So we all piled up in the Bel Air station wagon and went to my Uncle Luther's, but my dad stayed there in an effort to try to secure whatever he could save. And simultaneously, a weather reporter came, and toward the end of that interview, Nash said, "Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Daniels," and then my father said, "I don't even have my wife's picture. I lost it in the tornado." There's a picture of my mother that was oil painting. My mother was what you would call the help. She was asked to sit for that. They ended the interview and it showed on the 10 o'clock news, and later on that night, after 11 or so, we got a knock at the door at my Uncle Luther's house. And I can remember being there with my dad, holding his hand and looking at him, and this white-haired man standing there. And he said, you know, I saw you Daniels, I saw you on the news. I said, yeah, and he held this thing. He said, you know, I think this is yours. And he grabbed the bag and he grabbed the bottom of the picture and he showed it, and it was that picture. It was the picture of Amanette. After a tornado, 2 years, and one of the worst hurricanes, we had my mom's oil painting.
We live in an area where about every 30 years we're going to have a major storm on the coastline of Mississippi. And in 30 years, you're talking about a new generation of people that come along. A storm can be one of the most educational events of anybody's life. And what you learn from that is one day you may have everything and the next day you have nothing. And for children to learn that is very important. In a later storm, with my grandchildren who rode out the storm here with us, 3 of the families lost their homes completely. If you ask those children, I'm talking about children 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, what do you think? What do you think about all you lost? And I know ours said to me, Granddaddy, it was just stuff. And you find out what's really important in life when you don't have that stuff. And I don't need stuff anymore. Instead, I see life for what it's all about. So there's a learning experience for that. And I think the good Lord sometimes teaches us that the hard way, and those of us that are smart enough to grasp it learn it for the rest of our lives.
These storms, like Camille, they remind you about what's important. And it's not your possessions. It's how you take care of yourself and take care of your fellow man. And that sounds like it's lofty and maudlin, but it's really the truth, and it hits you right in the face.
What you find in a hurricane is the very, very best comes out. The majority of the people, I'm talking about the vast, vast majority of the people, realize that their neighbors are in trouble and they embrace each other and you help one another up and you high-five, and after that saying, we're going to make it, we're going to make it. Now, a lot of people die, and there's no soft words you can say for those that died. You've lost them. You've lost them.
Faith, Hope, and Charity are 3 females that were recovered after Hurricane Camille in 1969. They were never identified because of the condition of the bodies, and the county and civil defense director organized a burial for them here at Evergreen Cemetery. They were given the names Faith, Hope, and Charity because we did not know who they were. And unfortunately, back during that time, we didn't have DNA. These ladies may have been living alone, moved down here and not have any family here, or they could have been with their family and the whole family got wiped out.
Wade and Julia Geis have been credited with saving thousands of lives during Hurricane Camille because of the forceful evacuation procedures that they put in place. There weren't any evacuation laws at that time. They just did it through sheer will of force. They got people out of harm's way. Whenever Dad would hear things like that, he would just shake his head and he says, I only count my failures. I can hear them at night. I only count my failures.
No one knows yet how many have died, or why they ignored the warnings and stayed behind.
Mister, I don't know why they stayed, but I know why I left. I kept this thing 200 miles behind me, and I'll do it again. I won't ever stay and wait to see what's going to happen.
One of the good things about a catastrophe is everybody's in it together. I mean, storms don't just stop at the tracks, they affect everybody.
We as people need each other. And we need each other every day, not just when we have a storm. And we learned that, though, from a storm because it's absolutely necessary to show the need for each other. And that continues. And I think it was a binding for us on the coast of the various communities working together, but certainly of the people working together with private enterprise to join hands and say, we can lick this thing.
Our neighborhood was resilient, and that's what I saw about not only our neighborhood, but our community, not only our community, but our city, not only the city, but the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And I'm very proud to know that I grew up in a time where we were challenged with such a horrific thing to happen in our lives that we reached out and we helped one another.
Oh, well, I'm not really down, I don't think. Just a little wet, covered with mud. But I hope everybody in town sort of takes it on the chin and starts all over again. It's going to be tough. I don't know whether everybody can afford it or not, but I'm going to give it a whirl.
What are you going to do for money?
Who needs money?
Everyone seems to be in high spirits. Why is that?
I don't know.
You have to remember that people in your community, going back to the beginning of time, they have been through hurricanes and they have rebuilt.
And did you weather the storm in your house?
Yeah, we'll never do it again, I'll tell you that.
What happened when the roof came off?
I almost had a heart attack. It was awful.
And you plan to rebuild and move back to Bay St. Louis?
Yes, well, that's my home.
Do you plan to rebuild, or what will you do now?
Well, there's nothing else to do. This part of my house still there. So I have to go back. That's all we have. I have a blind husband, and that's our roots.
But there's one thing for sure. We'll rebuild. Yeah. We got a beautiful country down here. We'll make it beautiful again.
Nearly everyone along the beachfront has been wiped out. Their houses wrecked or vanished.
Many of our really nice structures that we had were built on the most prestigious real estate, which is on the beachfront. And many of those were wiped out.
It was not as devastating to the African American community because African Americans couldn't, whether you had the financial means or not, you couldn't buy land on the beach on Highway 90. No one would sell it to you. So most African Americans lived north of the track. And the railroad track has always acted as a natural levee.
One house in particular had been built hurricane-proof out of concrete, and it had special insurance rates because it was steel and concrete. And there was nothing but the slab of that house left.
One thing that they said a long time ago after the Camille came and hit, not being funny, but they said God must have been a colored guy, a black guy, because he didn't destroy the homes, black homes too much. He'd say just like he wiped out all the white homes on the beach.
Storms today seem to bring in a pretty heavy surge of water, and we've identified those low-lying areas where people in the past have lived and built houses that won't stand that rise in water. So a code came out of the effort to learn some of the lessons of Florida, which is at sea level, and to build our houses a little higher in elevation, and even went so far to say federally insured operations like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in banking prohibit making of loans in an area where there's likelihood that a person's house would flood. So we got people out of the flood zones as best we could, or if they stayed there, they built up on pilings and so forth so that they would survive.
And now we know how we need to elevate. We know how we need to identify flood zones. We know all the things that we need to do. And one of the biggest ones is teaching people about how to be prepared. Teaching people about, yes, it's a beautiful community, it's a great place to live, but there are some things you need to keep in mind. They didn't have category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This was before they did that. Camille, looking back on it, they said that was undoubtedly a category 5 storm.
We learned a lot at the Hurricane Center from that, and both as to what kind of meteorology and what kind of language we should use that would convince the people it was a time for them to go, not to argue about it at all. And it was at that particular point where the Saffir-Simpson scale had its origin when the two of us put together the thing he had done originally, the way I thought the Hurricane Center could use that information to warn the people in terms of not the storm which is coming, but how that storm compared with the last one that came in at that part of the coast and what damage it had done. And if you could say this storm is worse than the one that occurred 12 years ago, that's the storm you better prepare for right now, because that's what's heading your way. And people thought that was great. The people who were in charge of warning people in counties and in states learned from the use of that language, which helped them more than anything else in convincing people when and why they should move.
Camille was the top winner for being the worst possible storm to hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
Richard Nixon came here in the wake of Camille, and I remember my parents, it was so important to them to go to the airport and see the president get off of this plane and to just tell people that the rest of the country was watching and was with them. I got emotional thinking about my parents and how important that was to them, but when you think back to these events in life, they still affect you to this day. I mean, here we are coming up on 50 years after Hurricane Camille, and it still has an emotional impact on me when I think back, when I can vividly recall when President Nixon stood up. I have no idea what he said, but he was here, and people remember that. And they proved that they remembered it when he made his first public appearance after leaving office, was right here in Biloxi, Mississippi. And it was to a full house, and he got a standing ovation. There's probably no other place in the country where President Nixon could have gone and gotten a standing ovation except in Biloxi, Mississippi, because people remembered that he was here in our time of need.
Somebody will have another catastrophic storm, but we've got to just be prepared for whatever Mother Nature is going to throw at us. We're seeing a cycle, I've been told this by the experts at the National Hurricane Center, of storms being a little bit more intensive.
Just about every year when you have a catastrophic storm, it's billed as the worst ever. And Camille was the original monster storm. Camille was the gold standard, if you will. And then here we go, 3 decades later, when we find out that there's a new monster in town named Katrina. My brother-in-law told me this in the wake of Katrina. He said, you know, Camille killed more people maybe in Katrina than it did in 1969. And I said, explain that to me. And my brother-in-law was talking about how people who lived through Camille said, we are never going to see another Camille. So when Katrina was threatening, they said, oh, there's no way it's going to be as bad as Camille. And that was what you call fatalistic thinking. Camille being that original gold standard that we're never going to see that again. Camille's 50th anniversary is going to have more of an impact because of Hurricane Katrina. People can see how devastating a storm can be, and they are then going to know what we went through in 1969. They are going to know that, wow, Katrina, as bad as it was not the original storm. And real old-timers will probably tell you, Camille was nothing. You should have seen the storm of 47. It gets back to every generation faces its own challenges, and we owe it to our ancestors, and we owe it to our children and our grandchildren to show that we can overcome. We won't just persevere, we will overcome any challenges that are thrown our way.
Thank you all for being here today. I hope that you've enjoyed this as much as we did in the back. Catch us tomorrow evening for the program at the Civil Rights Museum. Join us again next Wednesday. But for now, help me thank Rex Jones for this documentary. Come talk to him, ask him any questions, tell him any stories that you have now.